Ask yourself, do you believe in providence? Do you believe in the benevolent guidance of God? Asa wrote to my father on my father's 17th birthday, saying, "It is said that a man makes his opportunities, but this is not wholly true. There are times of rare opportunity that come to only a few. But unless those to whom the opportunities present themselves grasp them and are prepared to use them, the result is the same as though the opportunity never come their way." To but few. Does that sound like providence? In 1905, he was ordained a Methodist minister, and he was pastor in a series of churches: Forestport, where my father was born in 1907, Barneveld, where my Uncle Bill was born in 1909, Shadow Gay, Richfield Springs, where my Aunt Bertha was born in 1914. World War II, being deformed, he couldn't be in the Army, but he did go to Louvain, France, where he was responsible for a camp for soldiers who came out of the fighting and were injured, and the soldiers, many of them were too ill or injured to be returned to the United States. So he was responsible for the management of that camp. When the war was over, he liked foreign service, and so he volunteered, went to work for the International YMCA headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. And then he was sent to Budweis, Czechoslovakia. My grandmother and the 3 children joined him. He's getting closer to Jerusalem. Anyway, in August 1922, he received temporary orders to go to Smyrna, Turkey. And when he arrived, those who were senior to him in the YMCA all left on vacation, leaving him in charge. Providence. August 30th, 1922, the Greek army front line broke, and the Greek army panicked and ran to the port of Smyrna. Some of the soldiers just threw down their arms and left. Others burned the fields, killed the cattle, burned the houses, raped and looted their way to the port. These are the Greeks. They were being chased by the Cheetahs. The Cheetahs were an irregular army of Turks, wild, undisciplined, bent on looting and killing and having a good time. And of course they did the same thing the Greeks did. Neither side had clean hands. Both were guilty of the same offenses. Each day, 5 train loads, 55 cars per train, arrived in Smyrna, packed with people and their possessions, all looking to be saved, all looking for ships. The Jennings family lived at the International College in the suburbs of Smyrna. My father and his younger brother and sister saw this mass of people coming and filled tins with water to give people water because they were thirsty. And they witnessed the Cheetahs, who were Turks, fighting to the death with the Greek soldiers. The Americans who were at the International College were protected by the sailors of the United States Navy. And all through the story, the Navy keeps coming into the story, playing a very heroic, dangerous role, keeping the Turks away from the Greeks. The Greek soldiers all went to a place called Sesame, which is right outside of Izmir. They did not protect the Greeks. They did not establish civil order to keep down crime and their looting and killing and all that went on. Instead, they went to save their own necks and got on ships and left Turkey. So all the Greek people were unprotected. Meanwhile, my grandfather, as soon as these people started arriving in town, he organized the American Relief Committee, which was staffed by Americans, employees of Standard Oil, people who worked at the International College. And they put the president of the college in as this head, the titular head of the committee. Another one of my grandfather's devices, get everybody involved so they work at it. Each person had an assignment. So somebody was responsible to get the ships. My grandfather had that YMCA Chevrolet. So he drove all around Smyrna gathering fuel and flour to make bread. He would pick up women who were about to give birth and single women. Women were not safe. And he was in the city constantly trying to help people. And at these meetings, he invited George Horton. George Horton was the U.S. Consul General. He was the senior U.S. diplomat present. He was married to a Greek woman. And my grandfather, who kept copious notes, I have thousands of documents he's left me, implored George, use the prestige of the United States to go to the Turks on behalf of the Greeks. And George Horton's answer was always the same, bring it up at the next meeting. George Horton, in fact, did nothing. Today, the Greek people think George Horton was some sort of a hero because his daughter, who lives in Athens, keeps promoting propaganda about her father. And in fact, he was a coward, did nothing. And I'm ashamed of him as an American citizen. In any event, that's George Horton. There were wealthy Greeks who had the money to buy passage out of Smyrna, and they left. And some of these wealthy Greeks turned over their houses along the quay to my grandfather. One house was a maternity ward, 500 women in one house. Another house was just single women who were vulnerable. He had over 2,000 orphans that he was caring for, but he didn't have a house for them. So they were out on the sidewalk, protected by sailors of the United States Navy. Just feeding 350,000 people. Huge. Big problem. Asa drove all over his YMCA Chevrolet, all over town, collecting women, orphans, food, flour. During this ugly period, the Turks captured the Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox Church, Chrysostomus. They stripped him nude, spit on him, beat him up, stabbed him, and dragged him through the streets to his death. Ugly. The Turks also captured a U.S. sailor, stripped him nude, and beat him up. And other U.S. sailors came along and held their fire. And they talked this down to a peaceful resolution. Those U.S. sailors, young men, were master diplomats to keep the violence to a minimum. Being in the streets of Smyrna at that time was a very dangerous occupation. Asa was in the streets constantly in the cause of humanity. All who knew him wrote that he was absolutely fearless. On September 9th, the Turkish cavalry entered the city peacefully. They were a very organized, very disciplined group. People offered them flowers and there was peace. Meanwhile, the Greek army was boarding ships and leaving 300,000 Greeks and 50,000 Armenians and Jews behind, unprotected. Then an Armenian threw a firebomb at one of the Turkish cavalry officers. It exploded and blinded the Turkish officer. His troops then went after the Armenians and all hell broke loose. The fighting started again, killing each other, horrible. On September 13th, fire broke out. And in fact, the city of Smyrna was burned to the ground. And that day, the navies of the United States, Great Britain, and France ordered their nationals to board warships and depart. My grandmother gathered her 3 children. It was an emergency. My grandfather drove them to the port. My grandmother and the kids laying on the floor of the car, bullets going through the car. And there's my grandfather up front, driving through the narrow streets of Smyrna, took them down to the port, and they were loaded on a destroyer and left. And they went to the port of Piraeus, which is the port for Athens. My grandfather stayed behind. Everybody else left. George Horton left, but my grandfather stayed behind. He was behind, the refugees behind, and the navies were behind. But everybody else left. My father, who was then age 15, returned to Smyrna after his mother and brother and sister were booked passage back to the States. And my father returned to Smyrna to help his father, who was so ill with Pott's disease. And my grandfather was working practically around the clock, honoring his promise to these people who were in his houses to protect them. On September 20th, my grandfather's birthday, he later wrote, he was overcome with an almost uncontrollable desire to get ships